Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, making a boot knife. This knife came as a request by a friend of mine who wanted a very small boot dagger. Now, my initial idea is shown in this CAD design. As it turned out, though, he wanted a shorter handle for maximum concealability and a bit less blade. So I took about 3/4 of an inch off of each end. Now, his idea was to make it roughly the same size as my Tactics Armory Agent, which he already owned, but with a double-edged blade. So that's where this design is going to end up. I begin by laying out the design on this piece of 1 1/4 by 3/16 inch thick S30V steel. I tend to make smaller knives like this from 1/8 inch thick stock, but for a double beveled knife, you really need a little more thickness to give room for grinding all 4 bevels. Not that it can't be done thinner, but grinding symmetrical dagger type bevels is challenging no matter what. A little extra thickness gives you both more strength to support a blade that's already getting thinned out by the double bevel, plus you get a little more room for error when grinding. As always, I prefer to drill the holes as my very first step in knife making. It's hard to get a knife properly situated in the vise once the contours have been ground. And if your drill bit wanders at all, you have no room left to maneuver. I'm drilling with a short and very rigid carbide bit here, which doesn't wander much, so I'm not concerned with that. But it's always worth planning your build so that you leave maximum room to screw up. Now I'll start profiling on the grinder using 40 grit ceramic belts. A slightly worn ceramic belt is ideal for profile grinding. If you start with a really fresh belt, you immediately scrape off a whole lot of abrasive, and that's just kind of wasteful. These happen to be combat abrasive shredders, but there are plenty of good brands. FYI, if you're interested in trying the combats that I'm using here though, you can support the channel and pick up a little discount by following the link in the description. I didn't do it at the outset, but for a symmetrical design like this, it's also helpful to have a center line and possibly some other guidelines marked to make sure that nothing ends up off center. I'm using layout fluid and a scribe to mark the lines. I'll also take confirmatory measurements to make sure the blade tapers symmetrically. Good symmetry is one of the key aspects of good knife making, and it's especially obvious if you screw it up on a knife that has a symmetrical design like this to begin with. Here I'm using a 3/4 inch radius grinding wheel to grind the choils and the backside of the little guard protrusion. Once I've got the general outline of the knife, I'll grind the bevels on the blade. The first step is using this little scribe to mark my grind lines. These will help me keep things symmetrical, so I'll just grind right down to these little lines, and I always know that everything's in place correctly. So grinding the bevels is by far the most challenging part of grinding a knife like this. Learning to grind bevels on a conventional single beveled knife is hard enough, but this is quite a bit more difficult even than that. Now you can grind them freehand as I'm doing here, but honestly this takes a lot of skill to do well. I'll show another method later that's a little easier for beginners. Because I'll be finishing the grinding after I heat treat the knife, I'm leaving a fair amount of meat for the final grind. I'll go ahead and rough out the handle scales. I'm using canvas micarta here, an engineered laminate popular with custom knife makers. Once I have them roughly marked out, I'll drill the first hole, then insert a pin to align everything, and then drill the second hole. Now look, there are a bunch of different ways to do this. Depending on your equipment, you may want to clamp the scale on and drill through the blade into the scale material. That's actually the best way to do it if you're using a hand drill. But the key point is that you want all the holes perfectly lined up so you don't have trouble assembling the thing later. Then flip it over and repeat for the other side. Next, I'll use a bandsaw to cut the rough outline. You always want to leave a generous amount of excess for subsequent grinding. Trying to make it perfect now is just wasted effort, and it's asking for trouble. You're liable to cut inside the line, then you have to grind away steel, and that messes up all your previous work. Now I'm going to be heat treating this knife with my own heat treating equipment. If you're interested in doing a similar project, you don't need a heat treating oven. You can get your blade heat treated by a commercial heat treating specialist. Many suppliers of knife equipment and supplies also do heat treating, so just Google them and you can find out lots of information about heat treating. For those new to knife making, cutlery steels are sold in what's known as an annealed condition. That's the softest condition that steel can be found in. So, in order to become functional knives, they have to be hardened. In this case, the knife has been sealed in a stainless steel envelope, heated to about 1900 degrees, then cooled rapidly. It's also heated for several cycles at a lower temperature in a process known as tempering. I've been through this in a lot more detail in various other videos, so you can check my playlist for some of those if you're interested. Once that's complete, the blade's nice and hard. In this case, about 59 on the Rockwell C hardness scale. Now I'll finish grinding it. This time, like I said before, I'm going to show a different method from the one that I used the first time around. Here, I'm grinding using a bevel grinding jig. Now you can buy or make really elaborate ones, but this extremely simple model does the job just fine. So all I do is use these studs to line up the holes in the knife's handle, and then I can adjust the cant of the jig with a pair of 1/4 cap screws to an angle that works for this particular design. In this case, it's roughly 10 degrees. If you're interested in making one for yourself, I've got a video on the subject. Link in the cards and descriptions. This one took me a good solid 45 minutes to make. You can make one with a hand drill, a hacksaw, and a hand tap. This jig allows me to flip the knife once to form the second bevel, then reverse the blade to the other side of the jig and repeat the same basic operation for the third and fourth bevels using the same two studs to keep everything located. What you're aiming for here is a perfectly symmetrical, perfectly straight grind line that goes right smack down the middle. As you can see, this one's pretty straight, but it's still a little off center, so there's still more work to be done. I've got to drive that top bevel a little further in. Now, as long as the grinds are perfectly evenly ground at precisely the same angle on both bevels, a straight center line will be the mathematically predictable result. Easier said than done, even with a jig. At this point, you want to be extra careful not to overgrind. Nothing will screw you up worse than being impatient and blasting your way across the center line too quickly. At that point, you really just have to throw this one in the scrap pile and start over. I've started the grinding here with 120 grit ceramic belts, but once I get close to my final destination, I'll switch to higher grit belts that cut a lot slower. I personally like using structured abrasives for the final push. In this case, 3M Trizac 300 micron belts. Structured abrasives like this don't cut fast, but they're very forgiving. You don't have any belt bump. They're very predictable. You can really cut nice smooth grinds with them. And that's critical for making that perfectly straight ridge down the center. Even a depression of, a thousandth of an inch or so will make your center line wobble, and it'll be awful looking. This particular knife will have an abrasive finish applied in the unfilmable guts of my blasting cabinet. But you could hand sand it, buff it to a mirror shine, acid etch it, Cerakote it, leave the grinding marks from the belt grinder. Look, it's all up to your taste. Now I'll go ahead and attach the scales. For this design, I'm using tube rivets, which are nothing more than pieces of 1/4 inch stainless tube chopped into sections and then hammered through the handle. Once the scales are in place, I'll use a flaring die that I made myself in my arbor press to flare the mouths of the rivets. I'm not using any adhesive at all. The rivets themselves pull the scales down and lock them in place. Now look, you don't want to do this with natural materials like wood or bone. First, get a little aggressive with the arbor press and you'll actually split the material. But more important, natural materials expand and contract. So eventually, if they don't just crack right off, they'll bow or warp, and big ugly gaps will develop between the scale and the steel. On the other hand, an engineered material like micarta will never move significantly and has perfectly flat bottoms, so they'll seat neatly and permanently on the steel with no gap whatsoever. I'm going to mill some grip ridges into the handle. This is not necessary, so feel free to skip this step if you're doing this at home. But you can do it by hand with a chainsaw file if you want to duplicate the job using less fancy equipment. In this case, I'm using a 1/4 inch ball end mill, holding the knife on parallels in my Kurt vise, then just milling back and forth. Then it's back to the grinder to take off the excess scale material, radius the handles, and blend everything together. Once everything's pretty close to where I want it, I'll swap out my flat platen for a slack belt setup and blend things a little. This 1-inch scallop belt is nice for sneaking into corners and tight radiuses. Another quick trip to the blasting cab and we're almost done. The last step is to sharpen up. And here's the final result. Now, if I were making it for myself, I'd probably have a slightly longer handle, but for ultimate concealability, this will definitely fit the bill. You can also choke up on it with one finger on the choil, which allows you to bury it a little deeper in your hand. Well, I hope you enjoyed this build. Thanks, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.